Hey there. As a listener to the Cloudcast, you know that data is shaping our world today. If you're ready for a deeper dive into the latest topics in data, you need to listen to the Data Citizens Dialogues podcast, brought to you by Colibra, the leader in data intelligence. In every episode, industry leaders unpack data's impact on the world, from big picture questions like AI governance and data sharing, to more nuanced questions like how do we balance offense and defense in data management. You'll hear firsthand insights about the data conversations affecting all types of industries, with guests sharing unique stories from some of the world's largest companies like Adobe, Fidelity, Deloitte, Hewlett-Packard, McDonald's, and even the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm always interested in the insights about data and AI throughout these episodes. I love hearing about how different companies are leveraging their data to take advantage of the AI revolution. The Data Citizens Dialogues podcast is bringing the data conversation to you, so start listening now. Follow Data Citizens Dialogues on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective as we continue to move through December, last month of the year. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody is getting close to being able to wrap up the year. If you are getting near your holidays, if you are trying to make your quota for Q4, good luck to you. Hopefully those purchasing agents return your phone call and they are not too stingy about year-end quotas and things like that. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. We have been covering a lot of stuff here recently, from the Pat Gelsinger thanks quitting to AWS reInvent reviews to lots of stuff. Today I want to kind of go back, something we haven't done in a little while, which is kind of touch on, kind of follow the money. And I say that because if you listen to the show for a long time, you know that we have always, tried to kind of focus on sort of two pillars. One is, what's sort of the leading edge of technology, in our case, cloud, and to a certain extent AI recently. And then also, where is, kind of in the keeping score of things, where is the money flowing into these systems, both in terms of what are end users buying, but also where is investment being made? And, we always try and use that as a leading indicator of, what might be coming next. Where does the market, think the technology is going? Where are people voting with their dollars and their wallets and so forth? And one of the things that happens every year is a gentleman named Benedict Evans, who is both lists himself as an independent analyst as well as has been a venture partner, a VC partner at a number of fairly large organizations, including A16Z and several others. But Benedict Evans is somebody who has been well-known in the tech industry as far as being what I would call sort of an analyst or a pundit who has strong opinions but loosely held, sort of loosely, kind of open to the idea of, as more information comes in, willing to sort of, look at things from a new perspective. And he's also somebody who with a sort of a history background. So a lot of times the things that he frames are in historical context, not that, what's happened in the past necessarily will show us what happens in the future. But I think, I'm somebody who has been on a similar kind of mindset as him, in terms of having an understanding of what's happened in the past in terms of, technology history, how have people reacted when certain scenarios have happened. Those can be sometimes good indicators of what might come in the future, but at least if nothing else, they give us a sense of when this scenario has played out in the past, these were the tactics, these were the actions, these were the inactions that various players took. And we can learn from that. We can ignore information, we can ignore the history, all those sort of things. So the reason I bring all this up is he once a year does what he calls his big presentation. He's a pretty prolific writer, pretty prolific, thinker about our industry. Did a lot of stuff around the growth of the internet and the growth of mobile and so forth. And so it's only natural that he's now starting to take on what's going on in the AI space. And so this year, in his sort of so-called big presentation, for 2025, he titles it "AI Eats the World," which kind of harkens back to the Mark Andreessen "Software is Eating the World" from back in the early 2000s. Anyways, what I thought I would do is, and I put a link in the show notes, it's a publicly available presentation. What I thought I would do is sort of walk through the presentation to a certain extent. And what I was looking for as I was looking through it is, what are the what are the things that they feel very confident in, or what does he feel confident in at this stage in the AI area? What are the areas that he doesn't necessarily appear to feel very confident in, or does he feel like we're at a stage where we just don't know the answers? There's not enough information. There's not enough trends. There's not enough action having been taken yet. And so what are those things? And then what are the other things that he's sort of using as criteria, as guardrails, as frameworks to start to try and make some predictions about where people might go in the AI space, right? Everybody from investors to the largest companies, doing things, to small startup companies trying to compete in this space. What are the actions and the biases that buyers and customers might have in this space? And so I thought it was a good presentation. It was about 100 slides, not something that you probably would necessarily want to sit through unless, this would probably be a 2-hour, 3-hour type of presentation, kind of a long-winded type of thing. But it's a good, walk through, and it's a good comparison of both where AI is today, where investment has been so far in AI today, what has been accomplished, like what can you point to and go, ooh, that's where the technology has taken us so far as of end of 2024, and where would you expect it to take us based on some number of kind of random data points and other things into the future, both in the next couple of years and maybe over the next 10 years. So I thought I would walk through that, try and highlight some things. Again, feel free to go through it and dig through it yourself as well. I will say it is not a presentation that unfortunately has any speaker notes. So you kind of have to read through it and think a little bit about, like, okay, what's he trying to say with these simple diagrams? What does this data actually mean? Is this data sort of biased to a certain extent? The other thing I always sort of say is, it's always interesting, and this is why we've always done this in the Cloudcast. If you only get your information from sort of VCs, that perspective of things, you're only going to see the world in certain ways, right? And you have to understand that VCs' view of the world is, we want to find gigantic markets. We want to invest early dollars into it. We want the markets to expand using sort of natural expansion and so forth. We want to pick winners. We want to sort of pick winner take all in markets. And then we want to, benefit greatly from it. We want it to be so profitable that it turns into something. And that's not a bad perspective on things. It's not necessarily always a realistic expectation, because you have to remember that the VC market itself is sort of based on the idea that those guys probably get, a few of their investments out of 100 correct, right? They tend to, they tend to lose money in most cases. They tend to sort of break even in maybe, a third of the cases, maybe 50, 60%, they completely fail. Maybe a third of the cases, they might break even and get their money back. And then it's that sort of, very few percent, maybe 10% or less than 10%, that become a big thing. They become a 10x, 20x, 30x type of investment. And yet those are the investments that they tend to talk about all the time, as we saw into the future. We saw what was going to happen. We predicted the future. And so you have to take these presentations with a grain of salt, knowing that, their crystal balls aren't necessarily that much greater than others, but because they are making so many bets on things, they do take a fairly broad perspective on things, because they are looking for, they're invested early, and they're looking for, what might come out of things, because ultimately, they're probably quick to sort of realize, as much as they want to tell you they are the smartest people in the room, that they don't always have the answers. And a lot of what they're doing is, kind of somewhere between investing, but maybe even more looking like gambling, right? Like betting on, all the numbers on the board type of thing. So anyways, let's dive into this. So a couple of really basic things that he sort of starts off with. Yes, tons of money is being invested in the AI space. Breakthrough results haven't yet emerged. So we haven't necessarily seen viable business models. We haven't necessarily seen profitability in any of these huge invested spaces, whether it's around LLMs or, I shouldn't say that. NVIDIA has proven to have a very profitable business model and profitable business of selling GPUs, of selling essentially picks and shovels to the miners, the people who are out mining for gold. But the people who are trying to actually find the gold have not yet necessarily found a business model or profitability. Now, this isn't one of these situations where you go, oh, okay, so we should spare. Essentially, what you would probably get from most VCs is they would go, hey, in any new market, there are going to be huge upfront costs. There's going to be huge acquisition costs. There's going to be huge amounts of time it takes for people to understand and adapt to new technologies. And then at some point, the world is going to have breakthroughs and things will happen. And that's tends to have been the case, at least in most things historically in technology. Now, it doesn't mean every single thing is proven correct, but that's kind of how that works. So he starts off with that sort of framing of like, we don't, lots and lots of money being put in. People are investing way ahead of this, and they're basically investing maybe even more so than they normally would, because essentially their thought process is, if this turns out to be the next huge computing era, right? So we had PC, mainframe, mini, PC, web, internet, mobile. If you miss investing in the next really big thing, and the people that you are competing against have a lot of money, the possibility of you sort of losing forever is a very distinct possibility. So that's sort of part of the justification why we're seeing such huge amounts of money being put into this. The other part of it is, he does highlight, this is the first time in, really since the mainframe era, that we don't have, or we have a marginal cost of what the result of AI is, right? So what I mean by that is, back when the mainframe was sort of the only computer, it was such an expensive thing that in order for the next person to use it, or the next big breakthrough to come out, it was fairly expensive, right? Like it wasn't sort of where we were today in terms of the way that we think about software, in that large amounts of money goes in up front. But then once you figure it out and you begin selling it, the cost of each incremental next user is essentially free, right? So a lot of times they'll talk about software really has zero marginal cost. The next, to spit out the next copy of that software costs you nothing. What they're essentially saying is, at this point, we're back to a stage similar to where we're with the mainframe, in which the cost of each incremental user, moving forward, does have a significant cost, right? Not sort of a zero cost. So, they make that clear as well. A couple of other things. They basically say that right now it seems as if, even with all the talk of all these frontier models and state-of-the-art models and so forth, we don't really have a moat. Nobody has yet created a moat around the models. And right now it does feel like the moat is really capital-based. So, the people that sort of have what feels like an advantage at any given point are really just the people that have the most money, right? And then again, this is where we get into some interesting perspectives on AI. Is the way of doing AI, especially generative AI, and again, this is kind of all about generative AI. Are the people that are going to eventually pay for AI, not the model builders, but end customers, are they only going to use the biggest models possible, or is there going to be a viable market for models that aren't, ultimately the biggest and most sort of advanced and so forth, or will there be, plenty of business for, smaller models, or, less, requiring less of the world's knowledge? Can you make viable things with 20% of the world's knowledge, or, domain specific really is more the question. And, he kind of doesn't get into that, but he does sort of say, as it is right now, models themselves don't appear to be the moat that maybe we thought they were when ChatGPT first came out, and it felt like, okay, there was only OpenAI's model. So the other thing that they sort of highlight is, if we kind of push this forward a couple of years, we're already starting to see the people that are building the largest models that are essentially saying, you should expect those training costs to grow 5x or 10x, right? So, so the next Llama model, the next OpenAI model, the next Google Gemini model, and so forth, they're expecting the environment that they train them on to be 4 to 5 to 10 times its size in terms of number of GPUs. And hence they expect the cost to go from, say, $1 billion to train the next version to maybe $3 to 5 to $10 billion to train the next version. And so that begins to, again, reinforce this idea that we're not currently at a stage where, the next increment of software is marginal. We have, large amounts of cost for every incremental. And then also, it does begin to sort of pull into question, as these companies are trying to build something that's profitable or at least sustainable for the marketplace, if their costs are growing 3x, 5x, typically what ends up happening is that passes along cost of 3x, 5x, 10x, whatever it might be, onto consumers. And so, for example, just, we saw recently where, like ChatGPT-Pro or ChatGPT sort of, enterprise, whatever you want to call it, it went from somewhere from like $20 a month, I think, or $30 a month to like $200 a month. And people are already sort of like, whoa, that seems like a big jump. How much more value am I going to get? It's not yet clear what people are willing to pay for this. But it does feel like people are still a little bit like, hey, if it was $20 a month, a couple of cups of coffee a month, that seems like pretty okay, reasonable. But when we start to get into, all of my coffee for the month, then people are kind of questioning like what value is there. And again, $200 is relative to whatever $200 means for you. So that was kind of the way they started this off, was that let's put some really basic economics around what's going on in the AI space. Let's put some really basic economics around, have we started to find a business model, a viable business model, which the answer seems to be not necessarily. And it does, and then the next question was sort of like, are there moats being created beyond just right now the NVIDIA moat of we make most of the GPUs, most people use our technology, things like CUDA and other stuff. Are there other things kind of coming along? So that was the first thing they sort of looked at. And then the next thing they sort of talked about was, okay, let's contrast that. So we've got people building gigantic models, at very, very expensive. And this is where you begin to see Evans start to do the thing that I think I do a little bit, which is like, okay, we have an environment. What can we apply from history that might apply in this environment or the situation that we know historically has sort of changed what happened here, right? And so this is where he goes, okay, models, lots of money invested, models very expensive, the cost to serve these to customers continuing to grow. What about open source, right? Because if you think about for the internet, for example, or even mobile, the original cost of say a phone or the original cost of delivering a website or whatever was fairly expensive. And then open source kind of came along and you saw things happen like Linux and Java and other things in which communities sort of said, we want the benefit of the breadth of the technology. We can't do this, given the current economic challenges of 4 or 5 proprietary options out there for us. We will build an open source alternative to this. And so he begins to sort of kick around the idea of like, how much of an impact will open source have on this space? I think drawing back to his experience of saying, okay, open source on the internet and open source even in mobile with things like Android, when those became viable, they really kind of unlocked possibilities. And I think what he doesn't really do here is he doesn't really expand upon it very much. And I think the reason for that is, as much as there are some things out there that are kind of perceived to either be open or fully open source in the AI space, it's still very much an open question because it's not so much, could the code for the model be put out there? And that sort of stuff is kind of being put out there. But what about the data piece of it? Because the data piece of it, how the data was built, how the data was tested, what biases were included, what weights were included, all the sorts of what you do with the data isn't yet really universally perceived to be open at this point, or open source in the way that we think about open source code. And so I think he kind of threw that out there as like, hey, there's going to be some possibilities there, but I think he sort of stayed away from it knowing that it's not really a known quantity at this point. And the other part of it is it has a little bit of some of the historical context of like, hey, when the tech industry perceives that the world wants something, they tend to put an open source somebody tends to put an open source version out there. But what's interesting, and this is where you kind of get into history, is, when it first happened with the internet, for example, like Linux was a very community oriented, wasn't started by a big company, wasn't trying to kind of create a moat for themselves as a big company for somebody else. Now, when you get into like mobile and you have things like Android, that was Google kind of saying, hey, we think that mobile is going to be a big deal, but we're not necessarily as connected to Apple at the time. So let's create sort of a free version with Android, and that will sort of expand the market. It'll also bring down the cost of things and so forth. This is where the question of like, hey, who's doing open in open source or in AI beyond Meta? You've got IBM and Red Hat doing some things, starting to do some things, but there isn't necessarily like just a community of people. And again, this is where it gets back to the cost of data is so huge, and it's not totally clear if the people that are doing any of the open stuff, whether it's open or open source, open use, totally want to give away all their data, because the cost of acquiring all that and the cost of all the data scientists is still really, really prohibitive. And it is to a certain extent a huge potential advantage or moat. And so anyways, he touches on that. It didn't make a comment one way or the other if open source will be sort of a savior or an economic unlocker, but just sort of throws it out there as like, hey, there's a thing. So makes an interesting comment then. He basically says, if anything in life is certain, and this is sort of an adapted quote from something else, but you can see it sort of about a third of the way into the presentation. He says, if anything in life is certain, semiconductors are cyclical, commodity tech goes to marginal cost, and every new tech produces a bubble, right? And so what he's kind of getting at here is where we are today is, semiconductors have shortages of getting GPUs, and hence, one company, NVIDIA, has sort of a monopoly more or less on that. They're able to dictate costs, they're able to dictate supply. But essentially what he sort of says is like, look, semiconductors have traditionally proven that if there's enough demand for stuff, somebody will come through and start to build lower cost alternatives to that. He tries to imply with, commodity tech goes to marginal cost, that over time, people will stop fixating on these sort of foundational models. And instead of having huge costs with models, eventually we'll get to a point where, the capabilities of what a model can do will be driven down in marginal cost, closer to sort of commodity types of things. But he also sort of says, I think what he's saying is like, getting to those couple of things takes time. And in that time, you have both expectations of what the technology could be, right? Like right now we are in very much a hype cycle of AI. But at the same time, while you have that hype going on and people want to be investing in that, they want to potentially benefit from it. There is a natural human instinct to not necessarily have, sort of lose track of what's a reasonable price, what's a reasonable market for this stuff. And they hype things up. And as we've seen in many things, whether again, it was the internet, we didn't necessarily see it in mobile, although it did take a while to get to having big mobile stores. We definitely saw it in like crypto and so forth. We've seen it with blockchain. There are bubbles. There are absolutely bubbles that happen. And it sort of feels like without him sort of calling out that we will have an AI bubble, he does sort of try and imply at the beginning of the presentation, like there's a lot of stuff in these numbers that don't necessarily make sense. And in order for them to grow to the levels that people talk about AI being, changing for every industry in the world, like the numbers are going to have to be much, much different than what they are today. So that was sort of the first sort of half of it, the first framing of it. And that's without them ever getting into what is AI going to do for us. This was really just, where are we today in terms of the economics of AI, right? Is it in a good condition? Is it sort of unknown? Is it in a bubble? Do the numbers make any sense? Do these historically look like anything else we've seen? So this is your first half presentation. The second half of it is really kind of focused on, okay, what are we going to do with Gen AI? Like what's going to come out of this? What are going to be the applications? And this is really where I think, without kind of explicitly sort of saying it, there's a lot of like, we're not really sure. I think it was sort of clear that, at least from his perspective, and he does a pretty good job of covering big markets and covering big trends and so forth, that the things that we've talked about in this show in terms of chatbots and coding assistants and those sort of things, we haven't necessarily yet been able to extrapolate out, like, what's the possibility here? And again, this is a hard section to kind of cover because if you're trying to sort of predict for people or explain to people, like, well, what am I going to do with AI? On one hand, you can kind of give these big generic answers that are like, well, sort of like, for example, one thing that's in there is they basically say, well, anything that feels like is broken in a system or anything that feels like it's missing in a system, well, that's where AI will sort of fill in, right? And those are fine. Those are big, broad, generic sort of, ways of explaining stuff when you don't really have like distinct answers. But those are also really hard things for people to kind of wrap their head around, right? So, for example, like, is that something where you would say, well, government bureaucracy creates tons of waste in spending. AI will just fix that. And then you kind of go, well, okay, but how? Like, can you go one level deeper? Can you peel the onion back one level deeper? Like, how do you see AI kind of addressing that kind of big problem of like big organization bureaucracy, hence wasted spending, hence slower decision time, and hence maybe poor accountability or poor results, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that you're kind of hoping for. And that's the kind of stuff that I think people are like, I don't really know exactly how that will work, but it should work because, AI builds smarter systems, and anywhere that seems like dumb systems or incomplete systems, it should be able to fill in. And so I think that's kind of where we are. The other thing was he threw out a couple of concepts. He said, let's start with a simple concept. AI gives us unlimited interns, right? That's the sort of framing of it. And what he tries to do from that is go, okay, if we had that, the idea that AI gives us, your business, unlimited interns, what would you then do with that, right? Like, how would you, what would that mean? And this is where, he gets into sort of an interesting sort of thought exercise. And again, this is where I think people struggle with sort of like, well, what's AI going to do for me? Is he said, let's apply that to the internet, right? And he goes, like, what kind of content would have been created if AI existed? Or, what sort of, what would have happened to the internet if it would have been really easy to translate between languages as opposed to maybe so much of it starting as English or it just being regionally based or whatever? How much more digital transformation would we have had if developers had, code assistants back in 2000 when the internet started? And I think what he kind of gets into is this interesting kind of paradox of, yes, if you look at that from 2024, for example, and you say like, well, what kind of content would have been created in 2000 if we had ChatGPT? And you go, well, sure, like you could have had sports game summaries written, or you could have had, entire newspapers written. But at the same time, you didn't have the input things going into these LLMs that have been created on the internet by people that, then eventually turned into blogs or turned into videos or turned into, all these sort of things. And so it is this paradox of like, well, what would we create if we had all the information, but you don't have all the information. So how would those things have been created? And so I think, he's kind of laying out it's hard to predict what the future might be when you only think of it in the context of history. But at the same time, he's like, you need to begin with some big kind of open-ended questions, such as, let's suppose every kind of white collar business had unlimited interns. What could they do, right? How would their business change? What could they do? What types of problems could they potentially solve? What types of new services could they solve? So I think the middle sort of third of this presentation is really kind of this open-ended kind of thing where they're trying to figure out like what's possible. Where do I think this is going to go? Because again, that's a question that's on a lot of our minds, and I know I've brought it up before. And then he kind of gets into some interesting, the last sort of third of it, and I'll kind of wrap it up with this last third. He kind of gets into, where are we with businesses, right? Because we often talk about AI being this great changer, this great change agent for so many industries, all these use cases. And people love to, Matt Garman, the CEO of AWS, and the keynote reInvent said, or the reInvent keynote said, oh, this has the possibility to change everything in every industry. And you go, okay, that's a super generic, non-specific, nondescript sort of thing. So he sort of dives into some data that's been collected recently as far as like, surveys of people in enterprises and across different industries, like who's using this. And the first thing that jumps out is it is very much kind of fits into the stuff that we've talked about. Like it's coding assistance, so lots of technology people are interested in it. It is sort of chatbots and the various types of use cases you could kind of have with chatbots, summarizations and all those sort of things, writing, creating marketing content, that kind of stuff. And then it's third piece. So chatbots, and call agents, right? So people that have interactions with people, to sort of well-known sort of conversational types of things, right? But beyond that, is they sort of showcase other industries and other types of use cases. It sort of falls off pretty quickly, right? So it's like, okay, that kind of confirms where we thought we were in terms of like the next great use case hasn't necessarily been found. And then what he kind of tries to do is he sort of gets into this like, okay, let me try and predict when adoption is going to start happening. Big time adoption is going to start happening. And there's plenty of people who are, kind of claiming like, hey, 2025 is going to be the year. Like there's been lots of breakthroughs, lots of interesting things. People are playing with it. And he had some interesting data, and he kind of said two things. One, he said, technology can take a long time to adopt. And basically, he kind of called out, he said, hey, cloud only has about 30% of the workloads, overall sort of workloads, and it's 15 years old, right? And for those of us that lived in cloud, you kind of go, yeah, but there's been a lot of growth in that period of time, right? Like, cloud was sort of like, you knew what to do with compute, storage, and networking, right? And then the second sort of data point that he pulled out was, he said, if you ask CEOs what their expectation is of when their first Gen AI app's going to go into production, at least 50% of them said it'll be at least the second half of 2025. And, 2/3 of them said it won't be until sometime in 2025, right? So, basically like 2/3 of all enterprise CEOs, right? Large company CEOs are like, we don't expect to see our first one until at least the second half of 2025, right? So, again, what that lays out is it's not completely obvious to people what people are going to do with it. And they want to make sure, and it feels like there's a certain level of sort of cautiousness that's going on to make sure that the thing they put out there first is pretty good, so that they don't kind of poison the well in terms of like, oh, the first one sort of stunk, and people go, well, I don't trust you, or I don't trust your brand anymore, right? And it was interesting. The second thing they had in there was, he was looking at revenues from consulting companies, and he said a lot of the consulting companies are claiming that they are doing a lot of business around generative AI. I know I've seen from certain companies, 2x or 3x the amount of consulting business they have versus sort of technology piece of it. And, the second piece of that sort of data point was, many or most of those projects are still in trials, right? So on one hand, it's good that companies are saying, hey, we don't necessarily have this expertise in-house. We want to reach out to somebody who can help us and hopefully accelerate this. The flip side is those, sort of consulting groups don't necessarily come with like massive amounts of expertise. I mean, this is like, it's like the old argument of like, oh, the technology's been out for 2 years, but I want to hire somebody with 5 years of experience with this stuff. So it's not unusual that the consulting companies are making some money in this stuff. They're probably trying to figure it out as they go along. In many cases, they're trying to cookie cutter stuff. A lot of it's probably chatbots and so forth. So I thought that was sort of interesting. Now, actually, I'm wrong. There's sort of 4 parts of it. So that's sort of the where does the enterprise stand? And it feels like the enterprise still has a lot of learning to do. 2025, second half of 2025, we'll start to see sort of those first things, and then we'll see where that goes. And the last part of the presentation really kind of got into sort of the question that we talked about on the November Cloud News of the Month, which was where does the LLM stop and where does the LLM start, right? Like really the question became, is the model the foundation of everything we're doing, right? Like, is the model just infrastructure? Is the model just an exposure of an API? Will we expect to see sort of applications coming from the same companies that build the models? Will there be huge ecosystem around that? Is it infrastructure? Is it a platform, right? Is it just an API? Is it the apps itself? And this is where, I think maybe the biggest question becomes, once you get past all the economics and, can you figure out a first thing is, how will these companies emerge? Because I think if we look historically, the companies that have been the largest, probably most dominant companies, they start off as being kind of a platform, right? Whether they started as like an operating system like Microsoft with Windows, or whether they were a platform like a Facebook with sort of social media platform, or whether they were sort of a platform like somebody like Oracle was, a database platform, or Cisco was a network platform or something along those lines. But we have seen in many cases, kind of a mix beyond that, right? So you could say, well, a company like Instagram, was an app, kind of independent app itself. And then it kind of rolled on into eventually becoming part of like the Facebook platform. Something like Office, itself could have been a standalone app, but it kind of became what it became because it was part of a platform with Windows. Now it became portable, and eventually it could become, a cloud offering. It could be run on a Mac and so forth. But you think about the most kind of dominant type things, they tend to be, kind of a platform. And then over time they go, well, I know a lot about how my users are doing stuff. I would like to own some of those applications, right? And so this was sort of the last piece of it was, where do we expect the AI market to evolve into over the next couple of years in terms of, whether you're a buyer of the technology, consumer of the technology, or you are the provider of the technology, is your strategy going to be, I just want to be sort of infrastructure, i.e., like AWS, right? Like makes tons and tons of money just being infrastructure, not necessarily owning applications per se, right? Or is it going to be in, infrastructure / platform, right? So you can argue that AWS or any of the cloud providers are kind of like that. Do you have to be more like OpenAI, where you own right now the most popular, well-known, biggest brand of app on top of your model? So ChatGPT on top of their GPT-4, GPT-4.0, whatever it might be. How's that market going to kind of shake out? And I think what he was really trying to figure out there was, how much fragmentation do we have? What are the 2 or 3 really big core choices? Where's the ecosystem going to be allowed to play? Where is the ecosystem going to get swallowed by the largest players because they know, they see usage trends and all that kind of stuff. And that stuff really kind of plays back into the same sort of thing we've seen with, with cloud back in the day, where it was like, originally AWS was sort of infrastructure. Eventually it became more of a platform. They started to sort of create services that, kind of competed with their ecosystem and so forth. So a lot of this stuff, again, there are parallels to cloud. So if you followed the show for a long time, you're going to feel some of those things, feel comfortable. But I thought it in general, and I'll wrap up here, I thought it was a good presentation. I thought, even though it in areas that you wish it had more detail, there were some vagaries in there. But I think it does do a good job of kind of highlighting, maybe the 4 key areas in terms of economically, where are we today? Economically, is there a viable model out there? What do we expect to happen in terms of if the economics get to something that we know, that we've seen before? What will happen? What happens if the economics don't get to that point? So that was sort of the second piece of it. The third piece of it is like, where are the potential buyers today in terms of their journey, in terms of their roadmap, in terms of their timing and all that sort of stuff? How confident do they feel that they know what to do with the technology? And then the fourth piece was really, what will the market look like? What will the ecosystem look like? What will partnerships look like? What will opportunities look like for builders look like over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and so forth? So I think it's a good presentation. It's good use of your time. I've been going now for 40 minutes or so. Like I said, it's 100 slides. It probably wouldn't take you more than an hour to sort of get through it. But it should give you something to think about. And there's some good data points in there. There's some good historical comparisons to other industries, to previous technology trends and so forth. And so, I would say it's a useful use of an hour. If you're in the market, it's good to sort of look at it. It would be good to hear people's feedback on where they think you got it right, where they think the AI market will be completely different than previous big generational trends, internet, mobile, those types of things. But anyways, that'll wrap it up. I thought it was a good use of an hour, good use of digging into. Again, Benedict Evans is pretty well respected in the industry. Somebody puts a lot of time into it. I think the presentation as a whole is not terribly biased, so you don't have to read too much in between the lines in this. But anyways, would love to hear your feedback as you're digging into it. If you spend some time digging into it, so show at thecloudcast.net. If you have any questions, or you hit us up on any of the various sort of social media networks that are out there these days. So with that, wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for sticking with us through December. Actually, there's been a lot going on here. End of November, early December. We will probably be doing mostly, kind of some wrap up, some mailbag stuff for the last couple of weeks. I may or may not do all the Sundays, Sunday perspectives, but I'll probably try and get at least one more Sunday perspective out this year. And then everybody will have a little bit of break, a little bit of holiday time, a little bit of New Year's time, and then we'll get right back into it in January. So thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.